I've been working as a night watchman for the past 10 years. It's not a glamorous job, but it pays the bills, and it's usually quiet. Most nights, I sit in my small office, staring at the grainy screens of the surveillance cameras, sipping on coffee, or more often than not, something stronger. I've always been a bit of a drinker. It helps to pass the time and keeps the loneliness at bay. This particular night started like any other. The rain was pouring down in torrents, making the already gloomy underground parking lot seem even more desolate. The water dripped from the ceiling in rhythmic plops, creating a haunting symphony that echoed through the empty concrete cavern. The fluorescent lights flickered occasionally, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. I had just settled into my chair with a bottle of whiskey, the amber liquid sloshing pleasantly in the glass when I noticed movement on one of the screens. A woman, her long dark hair matted and wet, was wandering aimlessly through the parking lot. She was wearing a bloodied nightgown, and her movements were slow and disoriented. "Is this some kind of joke?" I muttered to myself, leaning closer to the screen. I blinked, thinking the alcohol was playing tricks on my mind. I took another swig, hoping the liquid courage would help me make sense of what I was seeing. But she was still there, stumbling and swaying, her eyes wide with terror or maybe pain. I grabbed the microphone connected to the parking lot's PA system and tried to speak, but my words came out slurred and unintelligible. "Hey, are you okay? Do you need help?" I managed to croak out, but there was no response. The woman continued her aimless wandering, her feet dragging along the wet concrete. Panic began to set in. I fumbled for my phone and dialed the police, my hands shaking. "Hello, 911? There's a woman in the parking lot, and she looks hurt. She's wearing a nightgown, and it's covered in blood. Please, send someone quickly." My voice cracked with desperation. The operator's voice was calm and measured. "Sir, we're currently experiencing a high volume of calls. We'll send someone as soon as we can, but it might take a while. Please stay on the line and try to keep the woman in sight." I hung up in anger, not a smart thing, but the booze wasn't helping, feeling a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I called my superintendent, explaining the situation as best as my drunken state would allow. "Bob, you've got to get someone down here now. There's a woman in the parking lot, and she's in trouble. The cops are backed up, and I don't know what to do." Bob's voice was groggy, clearly having been woken up by my call. All right, calm down. I'll call someone to drop by and check it out. Just keep an eye on her until they get there." I watched the screens, my heart pounding as the woman continued to wander. Every time I tried to leave my office to help her, I couldn't find her in the parking lot. She was only visible on the cameras, a ghostly figure trapped in the grainy footage. I felt like I was losing my mind, the alcohol and fear combining into a nauseating cocktail. Hours dragged on, and my anxiety grew with each passing minute. The woman's image flickered and distorted on the screens, but she never left my sight. I tried to sober up, splashing cold water on my face and downing cups of black coffee, but the drunken fog refused to lift. My mind raced with thoughts of what could be happening. Was she injured? Did she need help? Was she even real? Finally, there was a knock on the door. I nearly jumped out of my skin, the sudden noise shattering the tense silence. I opened the door to find a man standing there, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. He introduced himself as Carl, a relative of one of the construction workers who had built the parking lot. "You're the watchman, right? Bob called me to come check things out. Said you're seeing some strange things on the cameras?" His voice was gruff, and his eyes seemed to pierce right through me. "Yeah, I don't know what's going on. There's this woman and she's in a nightgown, and it's covered in blood, but every time I go out there, she's gone. She's only on the cameras." I felt a bit silly explaining it, but Carl's expression didn't change. "All right, show me," he said, stepping into the office. I pointed to the screen where the woman was still wandering, her movements slow and haunting. "She's been like that for hours," I said, my voice trembling. Carl nodded, his eyes narrowing as he watched the screen. "Let's go take a look." We walked through the underground parking lot, the the sound of our footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. The air was thick and musty, and the flickering lights cast long shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. Carl began talking about his uncle and the other workers who had built the place. They had wild parties, he said, and did things they weren't proud of. "You know, the last thing we need is a watchman stirring up trouble and talking about what happened back then," Carl said, his voice taking on a darker tone. He stopped and turned to face me, his eyes cold and menacing. "You understand, don't you?" A chill ran down my spine. I tried to keep my distance, but the man's presence was suffocating. I don't know what you mean," I stammered, backing away. Suddenly, Carl lunged at me, his hands wrapping around my throat. We struggled, my drunken state making it hard to defend myself. "She was just a hooker. She threatened to tell all our wives about our party. She wanted to ruin our lives," he shouted, trying to hammer his argument into me. His grip was strong, and I could feel the life being squeezed out of me. In the chaos, I managed to push him, and he stumbled back, falling down a nearby shaft. The sickening sound of his body hitting the ground echoed through the parking lot. I peered down the shaft, my breath coming in ragged gasps. There she was, in person. The ghostly woman was standing next to Carl's body, her finger pointing to the blood seeping out and seeping into the cracks in the cement. Her eyes locked onto mine, and a surge of understanding flooded my mind. I knew what I had to do. With a sense of urgency, I grabbed a pickaxe from the maintenance room and began to smash the concrete. It was hard work, my muscles protesting with each swing, but I was driven by a force beyond my control. The sound of the pickaxe hitting the concrete echoed through the empty parking lot, each strike sending a shiver down my spine. Finally, the concrete gave way, revealing a gruesome sight. The skeletal remains of the woman lay beneath the parking lot, her bones twisted and broken. She had been murdered by the construction workers and buried under 10 tons of poured concrete. As I stood there, the weight of the truth pressing down on me, the ghostly figure of the woman began to fade. Her eyes, once filled with pain and terror, now held a sense of peace. She vanished into the darkness, leaving me alone with the grim revelation. One thing is for certain. I quit drinking that night.